Hello, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you are listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
So today we're going to focus on one of the parables in Matthew 13. It'll begin in verse 24, but just to set context, this is a long parable run, and in the middle of it, Jesus is asked, "Hey, why do you tell parables?" And Jesus is like, "I tell them because they won't understand them." And I think we've discussed this. We've certainly discussed the parable of the sower that precedes it, and Jesus is saying, "Hey, the kingdom is like a man that goes out and sows, and some of these environments, they grow, some of the soils grow, some don't." And so when he gets to 24, we thought it was really interesting to contextualize. So you've got this field that's growing 160 or 30 times what was sown, and then Jesus immediately tells this next parable. Verse 24, Jesus told them another parable. "The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, 'Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?' 'An enemy did this,' he replied. The servants asked him, 'Do you want us to go and pull them up?' 'No,' he answered, 'because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. We both grow, let both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn.'" So, now I want to remind us all, parables are stories. They're not doctrine, but they're given to us to imagine or to understand better. What is it that the kingdom is like? What is it that God is like? And so as we process that, just a reminder, this isn't doctrine. This is specifically a story to help us imagine and maybe conceptualize or contextualize a little bit more of what the kingdom is like, something we can't see, by understanding maybe a little bit something we can see. So Connor, what about this amazes you?
So what amazes me is later on, the disciples will go on, and we might touch on this later. The disciples will go on and ask Jesus, "Hey, what did all these parables that you were telling actually mean?" And he goes on to explain, and he talks about how at the end of the age, the angels will come and help take part in this harvest and separating the weeds from the good seed and from the harvest. And I think for me, what's just sticking out to me is that it's not our job to do the de-weeding. That's not the right. Is that the right term? De-weeding? Is that a thing?
I think that's the horticulturalist term.
Yes. Okay. Good. I'm glad that we're clearly knowledgeable about this. No, but I think what's just sticking out to me is when I think about evilness in the world, and I think about people sowing evil into the world and the work of the devil and the construction and the dispersing of lies that he puts into all of our hearts and just sows outrageously into the world, into the church, and into our hearts. I think about, man, it just seems so like if I'm somebody who stands for truth and righteousness and goodness, the natural response for me would be that, like, oh, okay, it's my job to come and choke out the weeds. It's my job to be the one to it's on me. As somebody, as part of the harvest, as part of the good, it's on me to make sure. It's on me to make sure that the weeds are pulled up, and I just think it is really freeing. I'm just right now it's hitting me as freeing how Jesus is talking about this thing that we all struggle with. We being people who want to see the kingdom furthered.
Yeah, I'll tell you, it just, even to hear you talk, that's the same thing. I'm going to articulate a little bit differently, but that's what amazes me too, is it makes me pretty sad. I'm pretty sad when I read this and liberated, because this is what I was taught was Christianity. It's you go into spaces that are dark and you correct it. You say, "Hey, as a Christian, can you not talk like this? Hey, as a Christian, we shouldn't be doing this. Hey, as a Christian, da, 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 da." That's what was modeled for me. And because it was bad for your business, like you couldn't be in business with somebody and then constantly correct them, that most of the time it was talked about with Christians. "Oh, you never believe my coworker. You never believe what they did in government. Never believe." And it became this complaining place but it was based on the expectation. I feel like what drove it was we're supposed to be correcting this. We're not, and of course, historically, I mean, prohibition is an easy target, but that's what this was. It was saying we have to correct these ills. And now I think it's interesting on the move that I've heard, and a lot of among the young, and I'm not picking on them. I'm just trying to see this as objectively as possible. This idea of we're going to create heaven on earth by getting rid of all injustice, And I'm like, well, that's the same thing. It's a positive spin on it, but it's like my expectation of being a Christian is I have to look and see evil and I have to bring improvement. Now, there are verses that talk about that Jesus came to, I'm thinking Acts 2, where he came to set the captive free, and even some versions will translate it free people from prison. And so there is that push of injustice. So I'm not suggesting those verses don't have application. I'm simply saying, I think what Jesus says here needs to really resonate with us on what our expectation is, not just of us, but of God. Like, I think it's really reasonable to say, if there really is a good God, and if you've been a Christian long and talked to people that aren't Christians, this comes up, how do we explain this evil that exists in the world? And this explains the evil in the world, Yeah. So now that will also, as with most times this happens, that will lead to what perplexes me. But what amazes me here is Jesus trusts God completely, and he doesn't feel compelled to clean it up. And this is the thing that is mind-blowing to me. Whether you're coming from the angle of, no, let's have hope and let's make this heaven. We're going to create heaven on earth by making sure there's no poverty and no racism and no systemic injustice. And I think those are wonderful things. But I think it's basically just the other side of the coin of saying we need to eliminate all sins to make this a safe place. And usually it's followed by for our children. Yeah. So we're going to be mean to, lesbians because we don't want our children thinking that's normal. So we're justifying not loving them. And I'm not even commenting on whether homosexuality is right or wrong. I'm simply saying the greatest command doesn't count here because I got to tear up these weeds, is what we've said. So now we have these, and I'm sure there's 50,000 sides to the same coin.
Sure.
But that part that amazes me is Jesus saying, I'm not here to clean this up. I'm not here to clean this up. And I do think it's fascinating. I'm grateful. You're the one that suggested, hey, do we want to comment on the parable of the sower? Because when I read it, I'm like, oh yeah, this is speaking to the soil that is reproducing and doing so good. Don't expect your life to not have weeds. I'm not saying don't expect your life not to have trouble. In this world we'll have trouble. He's overcome the world. But understand, God will intentionally, based on this, allow weeds, evil, to exist in your life that he will not remove. So when I look at my relationships, we processed my mom's death recently, and I think of my other relationships in my family. And in every relationship, there's part of me, I'm like, God, why don't you remove their stupidity in this area? Whatever it is that I know they're so wrong about, I think he would say, Jason, I've left that there on purpose, which is, I'll get to the perplexing piece of that, but that sense of, this is God's work. And I don't have to fight every ill till the day I die.
And I think the beauty of this is, like, as Christians, we have a outrageous calling to be a blessing and a light to people. Like that is our calling, and that's both spiritual and in physical meeting physical needs. I also but I think what's becoming maybe a little bit more clear for me in this passage is when we think about, like, the people that are bringing life and light to the world, them being part of the harvest, and the people that are allowing the devil to sow hatred and lies, which causes, these metaphorical weeds to sprout. Oftentimes how we tend to think, whether we find ourselves on the more liberal or conservative version of this spectrum, we go, okay, well, me being part of the harvest is dependent upon making sure that this specific kind of weed is taken care of. That if this weed is sprouted up next to me, or this weed is in my presence, this person is in this particular kind of evil or oppression or bad thing is happening, that this particular weed is sprouted up next to me, then that means my goodness, the light and the life that I bring to the world won't have an impact. Because when we talk about, like, because I do think, like, as Jesus people, when we live out the Great Commission and when we live out the Beatitudes, we do bring heaven down to earth in these spaces. but it's not, it's an addition. It's not a subtraction. And I feel like how we view it, whether it be, and I feel like how a lot of us view it is like for us to, because I do think God is coming to judge, and God is coming to redeem all of the earth. And we think, well, the primary thing that I have to do in preparation for the coming of the second coming, or the primary preparation that I have to do is I have to make sure to pull out all these weeds. I have to make sure that all this evil is taken care of. All this whatever is fixed. And I think the thing that has become apparent to me in a lot of the New Testament is we should be much more concerned with us being a part of the good harvest, us, like, our work not being choked out by the weeds. Our work is making sure that we are not deceived. We are not taken in by these false things. And by doing that, by being fully a part of the harvest, we then are a blessing to people. We are a blessing to the world. And I just think I think it's really hard for me to recognize that, just because there are, I find myself in a thicket of weeds where I feel like all around me are these evils and these lies. That does not mean that that I'm hidden from God, or that God is having any trouble in finding me or being with me in the presence of what we would say are our enemies.
Yeah, I that what you're saying leads to what perplexes me. And ultimately, I would say, is how do you keep this in, I don't know if the right word's in balance, but holding both truths at the same time. On one hand, based on this parable, and I think we can make the case in general from Jesus' teaching, is that my main responsibility is to love the Lord with all my heart and love my neighbor as myself. That's the job. Will that lead to action? Yes. If it doesn't lead to action, then I'd make the case, it's not loving. Because if I love you and hear you're in need, I'm coming. Mm-hmm. That's just, I don't think, should I come? Now, I have other situations where I'm in because it's my job that I'll get called and I'm like, do I have to come? But if I'm really loving that person in that moment, then I will just naturally do it. So it's not that your love doesn't, how do I say this? It's like the faith dynamic, show me your faith that James talks about, but faith without works is dead. He's not saying you better work or you won't be saved. He's saying when you have faith, it will just naturally lead to this. It's the way God wired us. Yeah. So that is one hand. And then the other hand is, I don't want to be, but what you can hear from that is, don't stand up for the oppressed, or don't get into politics or activism or whatever. And that's not what I'm saying.
Yeah. And this is part where it being a parable is important to reiterate.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. I think what I see in this parable is that spirit of, for lack of a better term, and I'm not saying this is the main point, I'm saying it's the application to me, relax. Mm-hmm. Relax. And then in that relaxed space, so we're abiding in Christ and we're trusting him to do his work, then I see, do my passions take me into politics, or do my passions take me into, standing up for an oppressed or underserved population? Fantastic. But I don't make it your job, because that's what usually happens. What I've experienced many times, I've known lots of people that are really passionate, and I am not about degrading their work. The challenge, though, is their work becomes their God. That's my judgment, is because you'll sit with him for an hour and Jesus isn't even part of the conversation. It's as soon as we get this done, as soon as we eliminate abortion, or as soon as we make abortion available to all, or as soon as we eliminate racism, or as soon as we, whatever the corollary good thing is about eliminating, I don't know what the good thing would be there, but as soon as we're, only judged by our merit, or whatever you want to say, and those aren't equally opposed. I'm simply saying, if whatever that thing is, it is so easy for it to become God. And I think the reason why is, if you believe my job is whatever my field is, and he says the field is the world, and so the direct and the sower is the Lord, and so he's looking over everything. So then we're trying to figure out, well, what does that mean? Because he just said if my soil was good, I would grow. Stuff would grow out of my soil, in the previous parable. Now, did Jesus intend for us to connect these two parables? That's another question, but the sequencing leads me to think, he's like, so for those of you that are yielding 30, 60, 100, then I want you to understand, weeds are still going to grow in that field. you know, and your job isn't to eliminate the weeds. Your job is to encourage the wheat, encourage the growth, you know. Now, so here's what happens. If I go after systemic sexism, as an issue, you see the difference between doing that versus I'm in relationship with women and I'm working to use whatever influence I have, whatever power I have to, number one, not hurt them. Number two, to honor and encourage them. And number three, use anything in my power to help them. There's a difference between that versus me fighting a perpetual weed system.
Yeah. And the first is all of our calling. That first thing is part of the mandate of just being a follower of Jesus.
Exactly.
The second can be part of your calling.
Yes.
But that's a unique calling placed upon each
person.
person.
And I think a signal of whether I worship it or not, I could do the same with church growth.
Yeah.
You know, I'm like, church is a beautiful thing, but I have a job in there. My temptation is all roads must lead back to Memorial Drive Church of Christ, the church I'm part of. You know, and I don't mean to suggest, only we're saved if you go here. But sometimes I get that attitude, especially when people leave. I'm like, what didn't I do? You know, and I can start arguing for a cause that the church isn't bad, our church isn't bad, but I can treat it as an idol, you know? And so I have to continually do work to step back and say, is this about Jesus? Or is this about my passion? You know, and that to me is the dividing line. But again, stepping back into, and that's what perplexes me, is it is super challenging to determine, okay, I noticed there's a weed. Let's say I noticed something that's really plaguing you, some sin, some temptation, some injustice happening in your world. If I experience helping you with that, I'll have a tendency to want to then rail against whatever it is that hurts you because I love you. And I think there is a good place for me to say, hey, here's the truth about this. But I also have to realize, now, and haven't even crossed this bridge yet, but our battle isn't against flesh and blood. So the people that hurt you, and people make up systems, you know, so it's not like there's some arbitrary systems out there and hanging in space. You know, people, when we say I'm going to push back against system, I'm pushing against people. Well, God loves those people too. And they're not the weeds, though they may be in collaboration with the weeds, the evil, you know? And so that's what I'm saying. It's just, that's the perplexing piece. It's hard. You got to take some time to parse out what's my motivation, first of all, and then what is it I'm really fighting here?
But what I'm wondering here, is this a parable? So Jesus gives this in between these two other parables. Is Jesus here trying to give a break here, right? Because like our natural tendency, even when we've been having this conversation, is like really kind of drill down, figure it out. Well, what does it mean? What does it mean? Like, what is a weed? What is a part of that? How much of that is a person? How much is the devil? What does this mean for you and me? And how does this affect our day-to-day life? And I wonder, like when Jesus is speaking to a very specific set of people who have followed him out and are now listening to Jesus talk about something they would have very intimate and boring knowledge of, is Jesus trying to communicate to them and trying to communicate to us of like, hey, there's a lot here. This is a really complex process. Like, you guys know that farming and horticulture, that's a very complicated process. What I want to do in this moment is reassure you that you are not going to get lost in the weeds. Because even for myself, like you were saying so many fantastic things, and I just kept thinking about, you know, sprouting off, you know, ooh, good pun there.
Nice.
No, we need a producer to you know, chime in with good pun there. No, but there's so many little aspects of what you're talking about. Like, I want to sprout off into a separate conversation, and I think those are all valid and good. But I found myself like after like I kind of like absorbed what you had said, I just was thinking like, hey, I had all these thoughts that I could keep going somewhere else, but I feel like for me in this moment, what I'm taking away is like, is maybe the thing that Jesus is trying to communicate partially in this, of like, there's so much good here, and I just want you to know that you are not going to get lost among the weeds. And that if somebody has come along and has told you that it's their job to pick out the weeds, and you've gotten picked out before, you got yanked up by the roots because somebody came along and told you that it was their job to separate the wheat from the wheat from the weeds. I'm just telling you that is not a job that I have prescribed for any of my workers. And so for me, like, I'm just trying to sit in that reality that if you've ever been told that if you've ever felt like somebody has come to try to yank you, uproot you, try to tear you down because they see you as a weed, they see you as the source of the problem, and that you're sucking out life from other people, I just want you to know that those people were not sent by Jesus.
Yeah, I think, and the fascinating thing is, so as I'm listening to your words, I'm asking myself, how is my spirit absorbing what you're saying and what I'm saying? And I'm like, yeah, it's really good that you said that, because I recognize I'm getting a little bit anxious, talking about this, because I'm like, well, okay, we don't want to do it this way, and watch out for that, and And I think you're right. I think one of the applications of this is, hey, in the kingdom, you'll feel lost sometimes, probably. Other people that are lost, or maybe even collaborating with evil, will try to, unintentionally, but they'll actually try to convince you're the evil. And there's always evil in us, or at least trying to be in us, so we have to be open,
sure,
but we have to be questioning, is this really from God? Even the messages in my own brain. Your brain will lie to you if it's been fed lies.
Yeah. And one of the greatest lies, I feel like, that Satan is always working in our spirits, is that he's telling us that we're the weeds. Mm-hmm. He's telling us that, like, hey, God is like, let's just, like, you are so in the mess. You are like, there's no way for, like, your little sprout to be harvested. There's no way, like, you are a weed, so don't even bother. And I feel like for me, like, when I see the tool of the devil is lies, whatever. I don't sleep. Tool.
Yeah, you're in a season at UPS where you don't sleep.
I don't sleep at all. So, and I would pretend that I'm really great with grammar outside of the month of December, but anybody who's listened knows that that's not the case.
Love your delivery people. Yeah. That's the message.
So anyways, no, I think it's, what was I saying before that?
I don't remember. Thank you.
Okay. Here's where I'm at, and then I'll transition to what perplexes me.
There you go.
Satan's biggest tools are his lies, his attempts to convince us that God is not who he says he is, that God doesn't want what's best for us, that God doesn't know what's best for us, and that we need to go our own way. And in this parable, you can place yourself all throughout it, right? As most people listening to this are followers of Jesus, and so you can find yourself in the position of a helper or the wheat, or you find yourself surrounded by weeds. You can pinpoint yourself all across the spectrum of this parable, which is why maybe it's so tangled, but in a good way. And I think the overwhelming thing that, like, I'm taking from the passage right now is this is a complex ecosystem, and it's a complex reality that God is working. And we get to have the benefit of, we get the glorious benefit of not being the people, or not being the beings that have to de-weed. If you've ever spent any time at the end of, like, at the beginning of a spring, trying to go clear out a flower bed and what's good, what's not, it's a hard job. It's really hard. Even if you're a good gardener and you know exactly what you're doing, and you know what is a weed and what isn't a weed, what's good, what's going to be a good harvest and what won't be, it's still backbreaking hard work. And so I think it's a good reminder that there is so much freedom to be had here.
Yeah, and I think it is a good point that you would say, let's state a very obvious thing. If you were to come to me for gardening advice and, like, hey, I've got my garden, I'm growing, there's a lot of weeds. What do you think I should do? Should I just leave them? I'd be like, well, I know nothing, but yeah, you need to get those weeds out. And that's very obvious. But I do think it's important that this should be a no-brainer for Jesus to remove the weeds, and he doesn't. And how much that speaks and underlies exactly what you're saying. And I do want to throw in my bias on this that I recognize is driving me. I have been accused of I don't love children because I don't do enough foster care. I have been accused of being racist because I'm not as anti-racist as the next person because of all the stuff they post on there. I've been accused of not being enough anti-abortion. I've been accused, I've been accused of a lot of things, And so that's the rub I feel. And I'm like, that's the thing is, you have your own field. and I have my own field. And it doesn't mean I shouldn't ask you questions. Hey, I notice you're doing this, and so I'm just wondering, talk to me about this, And it matters whether I'm loving you in that moment or not. It'll come across. But it's quite another thing to say, hey, if you're not doing what I'm doing, you're not doing it. You're not fulfilling, this. And I think this speaks to it because Jesus isn't saying the weeds aren't weeds. He's not saying it's not evil. These weeds are hurting people that he is choosing not to. And I think just in the same way, your weeds will hurt your garden, the productivity. But Jesus trusts God's power so much, he's like, man, if you keep loving God, keep having good soil, putting that back in the context, this goes back to what you said earlier, is you're not getting lost in the weeds. He knows exactly where you are. He knows exactly what he's doing through you. And to take a breath. And to take a breath and keep doing what you're doing to promote, loving equality. And keep doing what you're doing to whatever the thing God has placed in your heart. But just recognizing, there are other people that are fighting other battles that are just as important to the kingdom.
Yeah. Even
if they don't take up the view or the position I have.
Yeah. And just before I transition, the healthier the weed sprout or the weed, not the weed, the healthier that the wheat sprout is, or the wheat stalk is, the healthier the plant is, the more vibrant and the less effect that the weed is going to have on them. And so there's a lot in here because the Bible constantly talks about, battling the enemy's lies. And so I just want to make sure, because I'm sure nobody would take that from our conversation that we're supposed to just pretend and just shut our ears and, blah, 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 when we see the lies of Satan affect our lives or whatever. But again, just a parable. And there's a lot of ways that we can wrap this up into our story. So what perplexes me is, I think just what perplexes me, and we touched a little bit on it before, but there is a sense of the, why, if God good, why bad thing happens sort of thing here. And you get this story, again, it's a parable, but it's like, so there's a seed that's planted, and then the planter goes to sleep, and then suddenly this new force comes onto the scene and bad things are now happening. And you're left with this, I'm left in this weird place of why isn't there more preemptive strikes on the weeds? Why isn't there more, why aren't there more preemptive measures implemented against the weeds? And this is something that I've always struggled with God, because there are preemptive measures, there are things that we can do that God has set up for us to combat the lies of the enemy and his works. But this is just one of those things I've always struggled with in my walk with God. I was gonna say I don't like, or I'm not a fan of how casual Jesus portrays it here. And again, he's very serious about the devil. Jesus is so much more serious about the devil than we are in the modern church. Yeah. But yet still here, it's just you'll see in other parables, right, where it's Jesus leaves the 99 to go find the one sheep to protect him, to make sure that you want that protective Jesus. You want that, so there again, it's reading too much into a parable here, but it touches on a bigger struggle for me that I've had off and on through my walk with Jesus. And that's I trust God to separate the harvest and to pull the good harvest, the good wheats away. But it is that why does it have to get to this point anyways? And I think it's similar to what you said. Why do we have to let the weeds grow? Why do we have to, or even better, why can't the harvesters, the angels, as Jesus was, why can't the harvesters come sooner? Why can't the harvesters stomp out the weeds before they choke out any sort of life? And so, again, not a groundbreaking perplexion, but it just is echoed so much in this passage.
I think it is. I think in general, I've experienced this a lot, and the target has been, how did we get the Bible? Canonization. We talked about this last time about messiness and assuming it should be clean, because a lot of times Christian leaders have presented it as, obvious. It's obvious. It's so clean. It's so easy, And then you live your life and it's such a mess, and you're like, well, I must not be a good Christian. And I think that affects a lot of the depth of their relationship with God, that they feel like they're barely hanging on by a thread and scared to death they're not going to make it, is what's clean should be, I always can return to God. he's safe, he's trusted, he's trustworthy, and he has given me purpose. That's clean, But everything else is a mess at times. Your relationships are a mess. The relationships you feel great about today, will be strained tomorrow or next year. I've never talked to a person that's been married that says it's just been easy all the way through, or they don't really have a deep relationship with their spouse. That's the only option in terms of my experience. It's messy. It's messy. And this is messy. I mean, this to me, I don't think I've realized how much I subconsciously reference this concept, and I don't know where else it shows up, but you're absolutely right. If this wasn't in here and you look at the mess in the world, it's like, what, does this make any sense? Could a good God have all this? Why does this happen? Pandemics and job loss and evictions. And, that's not even talking about that's just a small dose of all the evil that exists. This is a really profound dynamic, and trying to take this in and accept it, again, it's a parable, so we're having to remember that, and then trying to integrate it into how we understand the Bible, which that doesn't mean that's what the Bible says, and the fact that I reject certain notions that I was taught, and I feel like I've got a more purely biblical aligned thinking process. I'm still not there. I will be unlearning and relearning for the rest of my life. So the fact that even tension I feel, is that because I don't understand this parable well, or is that because I have a bad understanding about how to live out my Christian life?
Yeah. And for me, I'm wondering is if I could ask God that question, and I'm like, I give him the either or, and he goes, yes. Like his response is right. Just yes. And now I'm wondering with the parable is like, because Jesus will touch on all these things that we've talked about at different points, but this is one of the more concrete examples where he kind of addresses it head on. And you want the cleaner version, you want the boom boom, this is what it is, and here are the applications for your life. But there's the Bible, even Jesus' quote unquote clear words can be messy, and in the process of trusting them because of canonization, like you talked about, it can be messy. But Jesus here speaking about this specific thing through parable, even when he goes on to explain it later to his disciples, not even still like the most clear thing he's ever said. You go like, okay, is this something that God, this is something woven into the fabric of what it is to be human, is to wonder and to not be okay, like to be always wondering and questioning and working through this. One of the biggest questions of to be like, why is there bad? Why is there evil? Is one of the biggest questions. Top. I'll do a big list for everyone later, but a top 3 biggest question
right.
For being in the human experience. And maybe the ultimate perplexing thing for me is that it doesn't seem like in this case, Jesus, by telling this through the lens of a parable, Jesus is not wanting it to be clear in the way that we want it to be clear.
That's right. Well, and here's the thing. You want to really, if you take this in, the offensive piece of this whole parable is he doesn't say, I can't do it. He's saying, I won't do it, which means he could. Now we understand that. We understand that in order to honor our free will, which he has placed at a premium, he did not have to give Adam and Eve a choice. He gave them a choice. And that's a principle that carries out. He's always given the people a choice. He never makes it where you have to choose this, and so in order for him to honor that, then you've got to choose against God, which ultimately is evil, But this is just reinstated here is when they say, hey, do you want us to go weed? He doesn't say, oh, you can't. He said, we won't. And our plan is to do this after this thing that we call life is over.
That's good.
And that's the part, that's one of those, are you willing to eat my flesh and drink my blood dynamics of, that's a tough pill to swallow. Now, even when I understand it. But when my child dies, when my mom dies, when people that I love suddenly were estranged and I can't figure out how to get it back, that part of that is the evil of the world affecting me.
I've never thought about the fact that Jesus having the ability to do this but not doing it is part of the cross that he carries, and part of the cross he also calls us to carry. And this is one of those good examples, because sometimes it's like, when we talk about, carrying Jesus' cross, it can be like, yeah, I would die for my brother, or yeah, I'm going to self-sacrificially love my spouse by cleaning the dishes, or by not, gossiping or whatever. But this is one of those really hard examples where it's like, no, I don't want to do that. I like, it's so, I can't imagine how this would sound to somebody hearing Jesus, but like, it feels offensive to be like, no, I don't want to carry that cross, Jesus. But this is one of those things where it's like, this is a higher bar than I initially realized. So, man, there's so much there. And I know there's a lot of complexities to this. And like we just kept bringing up, this is a parable. And then there's some explanation that Jesus gives to the disciples later that we touched on, but didn't go fully into depth. And so we note that we didn't capture the full picture here. Although it'd be so fun to be the kind of people just so certain to be like, well, that's it. Nobody ever needs to talk about Matthew chapter 13.
We're either a great podcast or the worst. I don't know which.
Hey, 50-50. I'm okay with those odds. No, but I've been really blessed, and I'm both encouraged and incredibly perplexed about where we have left off today. And so I just want to thank you for listening. Merry Christmas, Happy Christmas. What if I said Happy Holidays? I can't imagine anybody who's stuck along with us this long would be mad about that. But
I can't believe he said Happy Holy Days.
Happy Holy Days. Yes, Happy Christmas. And I just pray everyone's safe and healthy and good. Grace, peace, and love.